Greetings, intellectual deep divers. I am Brent Cooper. Today, I'm going to share an interview that I did with Alexander Bard. We recorded this last year, actually, March 24th, 2021. So it's a long time coming. I sat on it because I just wasn't prepared to kind of release all the things I wanted to. I had some reservations, but I just rewatched the entire thing, and I think it holds up. I think it's pretty good, and I'm always grateful for the exchanges we have and the opportunity to move discourse forward. So I'm happy to share that with whoever is willing to come behind the curtain and see it. We cover the issues of class, modern monetary theory, culture war stuff, Jordan Peterson, sense makers, and a little bit on Israel-Palestine. It is in some part a follow-up from our previous interview, which I've posted publicly before. And yeah, we got to get this Patreon community going. So I'm going to charge you $1 whole to see this interview and become part of the supportive team of the abstract organization that supports me, Brent Cooper, as well as the extensive networks that I'm a part of. And it supports this kind of work, which frankly, I think we need a whole lot more of. And I think Alexander Bard would agree with me. So enjoy this 1 hour, 45-minute interview, if you will, and strap in and sit tight because there's more to come. Okay, welcome back, Alexander Bard, to round two. I just want to preface this by saying, I watched our last interview as prep and took some notes, and I think I suck at this, so you're helping me practice. It's greatly appreciated to have the space to dialogue and to be someone who tries to push back against you. And we have some playful reciprocity there. And as you said in the last conversation, antagony and constructive antagonistic conversations is the way to go. So let's lean into that. And also just to
and your voice is getting sexier every time, so you're aging well. You're getting fans.
What was I going to say? I'm all flustered. You compliment.
Well, the thing is that you and I sort of started having this conversation because we discovered that we shared interests, and you were on each side of the Atlantic. And we, at least when we began having these conversations, it turned out that we were kind of two extremes in many of these discussions we were having. I don't know if that's the case any longer, and that's exactly why I decided to have another chat. This is the spring of 2021, we should say. Vaccinations are going ahead against the COVID-19 in North America. Europe is lagging behind, as always. This is a slower, older continent. But, we're going for lockdowns. It's still a mess. And what can we make sense of in the world right now as things are? And I think I love your perspective on this, Brent. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks. Yeah. And I just, I watched your recent conversation with Layman and Bruce, which you tweeted out. I just retweeted it. And, those are very constructive to watch. Because I know them, I know you, and also
we should call it Layman Pascal and Bruce Alderman. So they're two great guys, have a lot of sort of Wilberian Buddhism background, but are really skilled, and they're serious about their philosophy. They're really, really great guys. So we highly recommend them in general. So check out Layman Pascal and Bruce Alderman and go for their different podcasts. They're really good.
Yeah, and there was a lot of triangulation between the different topics like integral, metamodernism, game B, and the respective kind of meta theories as well, like critical realism and whatnot. And you talked about syntheism a fair bit. But I also, Layman's been a great kind of intermediary or liaison for me because he likes to translate my my polemics, my aggressive political critiques of people. So I'd love to do more with him and have he's a good mediator, right? When he tries, right? And so I there's still something critical missing from the conversation you guys had, which is the type of critiques I've tried to introduce these spaces. But yeah, I also wanted to just preface, as I suggested to you in the email, like I've been out of the loop largely for the past 6 months, kind of just on hiatus, kind of like, you know, dealing with depression and kind of
Well, as monks
regathering.
should. I mean, you
Yeah,
really are very
exactly.
shamanic. So,
Yeah.
of course, you
It,
should do that on a regular
I'd
basis.
say it's my sabbatical, but I'm unemployed, so I don't really get one, right?
You're employed by God.
Yeah, exactly.
Uh,
So yeah.
things have happened over here too. What I should
Mhm,
say is that
mhm,
I'll give you an interesting example, especially referring to our previous conversations. I became very controversial both in North America and here in Europe just because of a tweet concerning Black Lives Matter. This was like, I think in May 2020, right? It was just one of those tweets. It wasn't a big deal the first few days, but it got into the hands of an American British or Anglo-Saxon media company called Fremantle, which is one of these deeply capitalist, cynical companies that are currently pursuing the woke path for all the wrong reasons. It made me an enemy woke, but now from a leftist critique of the right, which is where I've ended up deeply in the last few months. But I basically wrote, I referred to Martin Luther King. I'm highly skeptical Black Lives Matter. I grew up in a biracial family myself with Black siblings. There's an African Scandinavian connection in my background, which I think gives me some liberty to speak about what it means to come from a background where we don't care about race at all, and where the same rules apply for everybody. I radically think that human beings are no different. Basically, if you're born into a river valley or into a mountain, or if you grow up in front of a TV set or in front of a laptop, that will alter you as a personality. But other than that, race does not exist. Okay, so I was controversial about this tweet for all the wrong reasons, right? What has happened over here is that I now sit and do podcasts with Somali rappers and former drug dealers from Capo Verde who come around to become establishment figures in Europe and things like that. And people are terrified because the white middle class that is sitting right in between these supposed opposing sides are now discovering that we're finding shared ideological ground, just through great conversations over here. And I just want to say that a lot has happened to me as well the last few months. You took a should. Okay, I do that too. I have to go into retreat before I write a book, for example, and to contemplate things like that. So it's part of your personality. That's what it is. But when it comes to my public persona over here in Scandinavia and Europe over the last few months, I have more or less become a Marxist criticist of woke capitalism. And I've taken sides with a lot of these guys who come out of the ghettos and the suburbs in Europe. And I've discovered they've been hijacked as material for white middle class people who basically run marketing departments at huge commercial fashion companies. They have absolutely nothing to do with them at all. And that's where the real racism lies. And they've discovered that. And I feel so honored that I can take part now in these conversations. And they start to have a proper class analysis, including themselves in that analysis. They can skip race, they can skip all kinds of things like gender, sexual orientation, and go for the real issue, which I think you agree with, really is the Marxist class struggle.
Yeah. Yeah. I have lots to say, sort of, rather than push back, right? I want to try to steel man your argument and enable you to not get into hot water, right? Like you tweet something and then you're canceled from this or that event and whatever. And I think we all need mediation. We all need to, I hate tone policing, right? But we all need to find better ways to communicate and support the incentives of not incentives, to just support the correct causes behind these movements that get co-opted, right? And I'm
Oh
fond
yeah,
of these
but
terms
I agree. I agree.
that point that out:
Yes,
greenwashing,
yeah.
pinkwashing, and blackwashing. As it pertains to this, it's like these are disgusting practices. But one of the key things you and I agree on, which should be able to be unpacked more politically, is ending the war on drugs, right? Because that is something so intersectional with race, especially. Um, and I don't want to dwell on these points too much because we went through it a lot last time. But like, I think you should have vocally supported Bernie because a part of his platform was explicitly ending the war on drugs, right? And so instead we have the Biden administration co-opting this BLM language, but then not legalizing weed, right? We talked about that last time. And so that's a very
you and
slow
I
moving
agree that
train.
the war on drugs is essentially a third world war, and the
Yeah.
damage it's causing in Latin America, and especially to Blacks and Hispanics in the United States, it just speaks volumes. I mean, this has scientifically should have been over and done with 30 years ago. It is a disgrace, right? So that's what you and I agree, and I totally support Bernie on that question. There's no doubt about it. We're fighting the same fight in Europe. It's not different. We have the cocaine trade over here, and again, it's white middle class people who consume the drugs. And it's all the Somali immigrants and who live in the suburbs who then end up in jail. And we have the same results of war on drugs over here. So we fill up the jails with all the wrong people, and we destroy families, and we destroy culture in the process, and the damage is done for generations to come. The war on drugs is horrible. And if I would be an American voter, I would certainly consider that to be probably, the first reason why I would go for a certain candidate. If they don't go for an end to the war on drugs, they're not civilized. So I agree with you on that one completely. But what I wanted to point out with the woke thing is that I'm not damaged. I'm certainly a man of privilege. I've never pretended anything else. I had a happy upbringing. I was sort of born and raised into the sort of media class, the rural society today. I could have become a politician if I wanted to. It was sort of absurd. Yes, privilege, yes. So I'm not hurt if I leave a TV show because I'm suddenly controversial, because that TV show can't have anything on it, not a Piers Morgan, not an Alexander Bard, anything. Well, this is the death of that TV show. And I get a 50,000 new followers on Twitter, whatever. If I do that, I don't get hurt. What I'm concerned with, and this is why this is a Marxist issue, is that everyday working class people today now see their jobs being threatened, because if there's even a rumor about them using the wrong term in a certain dialogue somewhere, only a rumor that they hit a skirt when they were drunk, only rumor, they get fired, right? So women and men are now under threat. Irregular jobs in North America and in Europe. And this is going to get worse and worse, because I think the culture war really is going after the working class next. That's why I'm vocal about it. And I'm pointing out, in this case, I'm privileged and I get to speak, but I will speak on their behalf, especially if they're being silenced. So I'm concerned with cancel culture and deplatforming, not in the sense that privileged people like a Piers Morgan or an Alexander Bard is fired from a TV show. Heck, we get new shows. But I'm concerned with that now it's working class people are being silenced by middle class people in marketing departments in cynical capitalist corporations. That's where the culture war is heading next. So that's why I want to discuss it with you as well, because I think you have strong opinions.
Yeah, and I suppose the best I can contribute to the cancel culture topic is that, right wingers make it a partisan thing, right? Like not to make it about me, but I'm as a writer, I'm like pre-canceled from being, having a valid opinion in the New York Times, right? Whereas it's what you're saying, the wrong people are using it as a shield, right? There's so many conservative writers for the New York Times that they write something that's actually just profoundly kind of stupid or at odds with new developments, and then they get critiqued for it, and then they whine that critique is a mode of cancel culture and unjust kind of persecution and witch hunts and lynch mobs and whatever, right? And so there's still the critical voices are still not getting through to those kind of media outlets. And so there's a kind, the whole cancel culture trope kind of falls apart through that lens. That's my general critique of it from the outside.
I would agree with you in the sense that if you don't do your history properly, you don't know what you're talking about. Cancel culture started with conservative Christian families in America in the 1980s demanding stickers on hip hop records. Okay, so that was like, get these records out of children's way. Okay, should have been an argument if those records had been dangerous to the kids, but in reality, they were very enlightening for the people who listen to them. And I think any decent white middle-class person today who's slightly educated and aware of what's going on got a lot of their education through hip-hop culture by listening to the band records. So it was the stickers on those records that started the whole culture of deplatforming and cancel culture. It started from the right. But then it got hijacked and became a dominant mode in a sort of critical studies theory, whatever department of the left that I have always critiqued because it ignored class analysis. I always saw it as a middle class phenomenon because it went into the symbolic, ignored the real and the material, stopped talking about money, resources, wealth, education, and started going for the deeply symbolic, the total media arena and the deeply symbolic. And this is where my specific criticism of Black Lives Matter comes into the picture. You very likely disagree with me on that. I probably disagree with you, New York Times writers, but when it comes to the cancel culture phenomenon, if we're going to fight it, we have to fight it from both right and left, certainly from the left. And we have to also know its history.
Yeah, I wanted to, we touched on jobs there. I wanted to zoom in on that point, vis-a-vis cancel culture, because like, especially with like writing jobs, a lot of these writers that are getting critiqued, they feel so entitled when there's many out there who are jobless, right? The economy as structured kind of like prevents good jobs from being formed, and the Green New Deal has a jobs guarantee with it. And that's supposed to kind of assuage a lot of this tension, actually, is to create jobs for these restless or unemployed people that are squeezed out of a kind of musical chairs economy. And so this question itself gets to the root of our economics and of our economic presuppositions. And you identify as an economist. So my question would be is, are you informed on the latest of modern monetary theory? And that, especially over the past year, more and more articles and more press has kind of, recognized its influence, its growing influence. And it's something I wrote about last year. I included it in my articles I wrote sort of for Thomas Bjorkman. We kind of collaborated on a trilogy there, and I made, because it was about money from his perspective and changing monetary policy, I wanted to introduce MMT. So, I mean, that's something that the left itself is divided on. And so I'm trying to promote this MMT left perspective through some very, prominent and aggressive analysts and thinkers on the subject. So what's your take on it, and what can we agree on? And maybe
I
just
think
a foreground.
it's easy. I mean, I might even
Yeah.
sound like Noam Chomsky here, but there's just money, period, right? So for all the different crypto systems or the obsessions with currencies, or could there be another economy? There's just economy. There never was a Soviet economy, an American economy. There's just economy. And economy is always regulated. It's either regulated by corporations that try to turn the economy into a set of monopolies or oligopolies because they make tons of more money when they do. That's always what, traditional capitalist industry will always try to create and maintain a monopoly. That's how they make money, right? That's not even anybody studied economics knows that for a fact. And the state could obviously do it. And if you look at the sort of Stalinist take on the economy, what eventually became a sort of corrupt Soviet Union eventually that fell apart, it was a nomenclature that essentially just decided to pretend they didn't own the assets of society, because then they could be a smaller elite and be even more prosperous, but they had access to everything that had value. So you would arrive in the Soviet Union in the early 1980s, you would stay in a mansion, you would have these great Russian friends who would introduce you and have dinners with you and get you drunk on vodka, and the horse would come in through the door. It would be like, okay, it would be over the top, Sodom and Gomorrah, Roman Empire, luxury. Did they own it? No, not officially. But they had the only access to it because they were nomenclature of Soviet society. These are the guys who then only formally became oligarchs 10 years later. There was no change at all. Russia today is essentially the same as the Soviet Union, and not even more efficient than it used to be. So there's just economy. And there are always restrictions in the economy, and the restrictions are there for the bad reasons, which is to serve monopolies and oligopolies. For the good reasons, it's possible to set standards. And that's why I'm working a lot with Jan Söderqvist. Our new book that's going to come out hopefully in 2022 is really celebration of open trade throughout history. But when we talk about open trade, we don't mean about the sort of globalized, sort of controlled trade that enormous amounts of wealth in London and Hong Kong and a few other places. I'm talking about, the open trade that did exist along the Silk Route, where this sort of accumulation of wealth in certain places wasn't really the case. What happened was that all the different trading posts along the Silk Route actually prospered enormously. And they prospered enormously because there was just standards. So you would go to a bazaar, you'd be a trader, You'd wash your clothes. You get it, you go to the bathhouse and fix yourself in the morning and get a good breakfast. You go to the bazaar and you try to get in. You would try to get in with certain documents to have a place at the bazaar to trade, so that the right people who could be trusted were the traders inside the bazaar, because that made everything a lot easier, but there was a lot of competition going on. This created enormous wealth that was distributed widely across the entire Eurasian continent. China, India, and later Europe and the Middle East built their entire prosperity for over 2,000 years on the Silk Route. And it was also much more widely dispersed than it is today. So those are the models I'm looking at. It's not the regulation. Certainly the state regulation, for example, of an economy isn't a good thing. It is a good thing because we need standards and we need the infrastructure for an economy to work. But when it comes to the monopolies and the oligopolies, when they try to control an economy, yeah, it will go towards the nomenclatural sort of system you have, for example, in Russia today, with enormous wealth at the top and then, huge poverty at the bottom. And the United States has been heading in that direction. So as a Scandinavian today, I am for a radical, lowering of the taxes in a country like Sweden, because we have a welfare state that's become too corrupt, too bureaucratic, too involved in people's heads, too obsessed with changing people's minds rather than actually just redistributing wealth, which is the only good reason why you should tax people. You tax people for the services that companies will not care about, essentially education, infrastructure, healthcare for the elderly, things like that. Once you tax them for that, the question is, why would you tax them for the rest? Why would you tax them 67%, 70%? So I'm, as an Hegelian, I go with the right over here in Scandinavia. I would certainly go with the left in America, which is today a low tax economy with enormous deductions for the wealthy, with a wealthier and wealthier, smaller and smaller elite, and with a very struggling working class at the bottom. And then, of course, a new working class at the bottom who don't even have jobs. So, it depends on the economy, the specific culture, the specific system you're looking at, which I think is the honest and decent political position you should take.
MMT proponents, I'm going to try to list off some tenets here so we're on the same page. But one of the top lines is, monetary sovereignty of currency issuers, right? So any state that's a currency issuer can do MMT, which is in part an inversion of the main assumption of tax and spend, right? So you talked a lot about taxes, and so it's an assumption of classical economics and governance that you tax and then you have a kind of budget to spend from those tax dollars. But MMT sort of reverses that assumption and says, you can print money kind of ad infinitum with limits, of course, but that the idea is the U.S. cannot run out of its own money, right? It can be in debt to other countries, but it can never default. It can never go bankrupt. And so it's the inversion of these assumptions because they're saying that the assumptions are a kind of a lie that we've been sold, along with many other lies about, this or that war or conspiracy or whatever, right? Or religion. The public is often sold a false bill of goods, no pun intended. So in MMT, I watched a talk yesterday by Andres Bernal. And he's pretty deep in this stuff, right? So I recommend the Superstructure podcast, of which he's a part, and that kind of community of thinkers. And he was talking about deficit hawks, deficit doves, and a dove is someone like Paul Krugman, says we can do some deficits, but with cutbacks. And then there's deficit owls, which are usually the most left progressive people, people like Ayanna Pressley and Rashida Tlaib, who want a jobs guarantee and know how to pay for it, right? They can rebut those questions of how you're going to pay for it by minting $1 trillion coin, and that's not as frivolous as it sounds. It's just it's using a kind of meta theory to restructure the fiscal space, right? To make a Green New Deal possible, to silence all the naysayers. And so again, I'm trying within my limited knowledge on this subject to kind of invite you as a proponent to be a proponent of it, to be an economic proponent of it, because
but I am studying all these things. I read all the time. So you should study. We should say to everybody who gets involved in this conversation, if you study economics, read both left and right. because very often economics is not about ideology at all. It's really about different ideas, trying them out. So we don't know what's going to happen with US inflation. All we know, there's a lot of money is being printed, and America is again running large budget deficits. Okay. Is that a problem? It's not necessarily a problem. One, if you consider the current circumstances to be extraordinary, you're always borrowing from the future when you print more money than you have. Okay. Because you expect that wealth could be huge 40 years from now. So you could actually borrow. And you also expect, for example, that COVID-19 is an extraordinary event which requires extraordinary budgets. And so you basically take a loan from the future. You do that always when you print money in this sense. So you're running a huge budget deficit. Inflation might still be low. Then a lot of people say we can print more money. The problem is that there's always a tipping point when you print money like that before you run into a Zimbabwean or a Venezuelan or a Germany between the wars kind of economy. What then happens is that suddenly a lot of people realize that a lot of money is floating around. It doesn't really have any, foundation anywhere. It's been printed because people are borrowing like crazy from the future, from future generations. And when you borrow from future generations, either those future generations have to repay in cash later when you have to run, the opposite of a budget deficit, which is a surplus, okay? Because it has to be evened out in the long run, or inflation kicks in. And what happens when the inflation kicks in is that the dollar loses value. It loses value compared to other currencies in the rest of the world, and it might dramatically do so. And inflation, if you look at Turkey, for example, today, their lira, which is the Turkey, I live in Istanbul half time, so I've seen how poor Turkey has become over the last 3 years. The Turkish lira is worth about half today compared to what it was 3 years ago when I compared to the Swedish krona or the US dollar, meaning people in Turkey are half as rich or double as poor as they were 3 years ago. It's now an incredibly poor third world country again because the Turkish lira has fallen desperately in value. Why? Because when Erdogan, who is a very arrogant dictator, when he doesn't like what the economists actually tell him are the rules of the game, he prints more money than he can, and he's not trusted in the world market. He's not trusted by his own people. So they realize this is going to be inflation again, and inflation kicks in and lies around at a 30, 40% level. And the problem with inflation is this one, is that wealthy people will always buy stable assets when inflation kicks in. They buy gold. They buy works of art. And they also buy equity in companies, with actually, because a company can just raise its price if inflation kicks in. Now, it's not a good thing for a company to have tons of inflation around it, but certainly, if you've got a company, you're selling a product or a service, and your competitors are obviously raising the price because of inflation, so do you. So the corruption, the companies of Turkey don't go down. But what happens with the Turkish economy is that it hits the very poor. And this is something Krugman, for example, leftist economists, they always stress that if inflation does kick in, you better stop printing money right away, because inflation really hurts the poor. It always hurts the people at the bottom of society the worst. And if you don't understand this, you should go to countries like Turkey and Argentina. It should be two of the wealthiest countries in the world. They have absolutely everything, highly educated populations, raw materials, farms, everything. They're like fantastic countries. By the way, two of the most fascinating countries in the world to visit. Stunning nature, big countries, populations are handleable.
I've been to Argentina.
And these countries are countries that are suffering a lot from inflation, and it hits the poor the most. So we should remember that before we have leftists coming in and say that, well, we could print more money, because they're likely to do that thinking that you can just print money and nothing's going to happen. But it does, and that is the inflation ghost. Sure. And all economists agree on that, and this is also history. You can learn it from economic history.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I gotta take your word for it in this moment, and also kind of, hold in my mind what the counterpoint is, because they literally talk about these things, right? So MMTers would have answers for you, and I think those would be good engagements. And hopefully I can set something up, a kind of three-way or something, because obviously hyperinflation is crippling, but they have answers to that. And
well, it's that Bitcoin will not go into inflation. That's exactly what's worth $60,000 in Bitcoin. But the problem is, if you want to invest in a currency that doesn't give you any payoff at all, it's just there, then you can buy Swiss francs. Switzerland has no inflation, but it also doesn't give you any, You don't get anything. If you put your money in Swiss bank, you get less out the next year than you did the year before. It's just security for wealthy people. That's why the Swiss franc works that way. Gold is the same way. Precious metals, they're not abundant. You know, it's really hard to extract gold and platinum, so they're valuable. But the problem with Bitcoin, I think, with an inflation-proof currency like Bitcoin, is that it will only create more wealth for the already wealthy. And it will not be for the working classes. Actually, they're the losers who probably speculate last. So that's the problem in many of these ideas about currencies. If you're leftist, is that I begin to sound like Noam Chomsky, I said, or Piketty here, but I think redistribution of wealth is the ultimate leftist cause in politics. And that means you take money from the wealthy and give it to the poor. You don't give cash to the poor, you invest it in the future of the poor.
So I'm aligned with the sentiment and still to tax the rich, but their answer to that is that that's kind of old paradigm thinking, and that they're talking about pre-distribution rather than redistribution.
Of course they do, because they don't want to pay taxes. Yeah.
No, well, it's not just
they would say. Of course they would say.
No, because it's not. They don't want to eliminate taxes, but the general point I want to make too, and we kind of breezed through some of the assumptions, is that they're actually saying that the right is controlling a lot of the assumptions of the conversation to our detriment. And so, actually Andres cited Cenk Uygur versus Ben Shapiro as a fairly public debate a few years back, where actually, Cenk was winning on some terms, but was having to accept some of Ben Shapiro's, capitalist realism tenets and sort of thing. So, and the distinction that MMTers are making is public money versus private money, right? And so public money for public spending, not just money for redistribution. And as you know, I advocate UBI, but they're advocating much bigger projects like a Green New Deal as a massive infrastructure project, and is this sort of pre-distribution and at the same time addressing social justice concerns, real concerns, without the wokeism, without the hyper wokeism that turns others off.
Yeah, and we invite everybody, go out, check out Superstructure, make up your own mind. Okay, the problem is all these fantasies have been repeatedly said throughout economic history, and it's always like somebody's the wizard waving around like out of thin air, they invent resources here. That's not how resources work, okay? If you own a mine and it has metals in it, if you have money in your bank account, those are resources. Okay, the only thing we've added historically to capital, this is where my work with Seneca comes in, is attention. And why we've added attention and moving into intentionalist society is that the things that are the most valuable today are the things that we're not likely to sell to anybody. Our own eyeballs, our own eardrums, our own bodies, love for family and kin and deep respect, things that we don't put on the market. And I'm interested therefore philosophically in the difference between the sacred and the profane, because what is now finally happening when capitalism no longer works is that capitalism, which is marketing, essentially marketing, advertising, PR, capitalism is now going after those things that we hold sacred. And by telling us that the sacred is now profane and tradable and trying to convince us of that, capitalism is trying to move under our skin. And this is where eventually there will be a fight back. And that's why I believe capitalism will go towards intentionalism. And I think it's through intentionalism that communism is eventually possible. I don't think socialism was ever an alternative there, because socialism only became, for example, a social democracy in Europe when it worked decently well and is still around. It only became a way of taxing the wealthy to a certain point, and especially taxing the middle classes, and then just throwing that money around and putting it out not as investments in the future for the poor, but actually putting it out as substitutes for taking your taxes away back to the rich, by making it a political propaganda machine and making a large public sector that really doesn't serve the poor at all. It only serves itself. And that is what I see as the corruption, for example, of France, Germany, and Scandinavia, where these countries are wasting some 30 to 40% of the GDP currently, or just throwing around the money between the middle classes to turn a middle class that was productive and worked hard into a middle class that is basically working in the public sector in jobs that we don't need. And that is why Europe is falling behind East Asia and North America when it comes to economics. This is a major burden here. So if I'm a leftist, I would still argue for lowering taxes over here to clean up the place and then try to find new ways of redistributing wealth from the wealthy to the poor and investing in the future of the poor, investing in education and infrastructure. That's what you should do. America could do it right away because in America, I think it's an open goal. And I think all of these sort of Silicon Valley fantasies about universal basic income. Well, hey, when Apple's Tim Cook starts arguing for universal basic income while moving all of Apple to Ireland to escape taxes from around the world, so his own fucking company doesn't pay a penny in taxes. I have never seen a bigger hypocrite in human history. This is Silicon Valley capitalism in its really worst form. It is disgusting. It's Leonardo DiCaprio going to Albania to stop somebody from, building a dam that could provide electricity to the poor in Albania because he doesn't want there to be a dam, because he doesn't want to have his view destroyed when he goes on a holiday. It is despicable. I think when Hollywood and Silicon Valley unite and create a fake left, I think that's really when the left should stand up and speak out and say, no, this is completely unacceptable. And at the end of the day, take it back to class analysis, which is the redistribution of resources that are finite and must already exist. They cannot be invented out of thin air. That's not how economics works.
Yeah. So where my mind goes from the end of that is, a convergence between Hollywood and Silicon Valley, kind of is instantiated in like the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, and that's been a topic of conversation. And, there's some good intentions there, obviously, but Jacobin had a couple critiques of that, specifically saying, it's not critiquing capitalism. It's missing the mark. It's on a lower level of analysis.
Yeah, things are 10 times worse than the social dilemma ever.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
It's a bit like this is April now, 2021. So this is a bit like the Oprah Winfrey, Meghan Markle interview. It's just like the first thing you think is that Meghan Markle is what an asshole. It's just like, hey, you're a fucking princess in a big castle and you moan and bitch about your life. Have you got a clue what it's like to be a poor person raising a family of 5? No, of course she doesn't. But at the end of the day, it's one of these sort of fake controversies. It's a monarchy, for God's sake. It is at best a museum with old people in it that it's not too costly, that we can laugh at, and hopefully it has no power any longer at best. But it's really set up as sort of a media spectacle, pretending that monarchy must be saved. As the one thing that's not told. And Meghan Markle is really part of that game. And at the end of the day, you should disqualify the entire discourse in this case. The same thing with the social dilemma. It's just saving capitalism by pretending capitalism could have a good face. It can't.
Yeah. I mean, I'll meet you halfway too. Like, I think you can mock things like that interview for sure, but it is like having a place and moving the mainstream, let's say mainstream narrative forward of the inevitable collapse of monarchy, right? The abdication of Prince Harry, right, is important. It's not just frivolous. And yes, he's privileged and all that, but the fact
it's an abdication with $200 million in the budget. It's just like it's not an abdication, but
we can say that it's just sensationalist. It's sensationalist and it's theater. We can say that, but I think it's a meaningful inflection point for critique for millions of people who are on the fence about monarchy. It's helping move that conversation forward, because I think these are vestiges.
But this is like but the wealthy whining and moaning about being wealthy was always pathetic. And that's the problem here. And at least the Queen of England has the decency not to say she's anything but privileged, right? So that was a Meghan Markle loses out, at least on this side of the pond. She's killed herself, more or less. But the thing is with the social dilemma, way more important, right? So when you and I agree, things are at least 10 times worse. The social dilemma is made to save capitalism in Silicon Valley. Clearly, right? It's pointing out, we didn't know we were that evil. Yes, you did. Okay. Facebook consciously hired thousands of psychologists to make millions of Americans addicted to Facebook. Even a Chinese fentanyl trader couldn't be that evil. And they knew. I was in those meetings. Right? I'm one of those people who was in those meetings and left. They all knew, and they knew all along. And now they got to clean it up. And my recommendation to these companies, when I talk to them, is to get the diversity offers, interesting enough, out of there, to not pretend they can play around with woke, because they can't. I think a capitalist corporation has three values. One, it gives the customers a fantastic experience, including hopefully a good service, or a product of some kind, and you take pride in that. Number two, it pays its workers really well, and it takes pride in telling the story that we pay our workers really well, and we inspire our workers to be politically and spiritually active in their spare time. That's a prerogative of our workers. It's none of our business. The company must be a completely depoliticized place, precisely so that politics can be strong, so that citizens can engage in politics, which should be their dominion, right? And third, you're obviously paying somebody invested, you're paying some stockholders of the company some kind of profit because they invested in the company. Now, fair enough, that's what capitalism is. You can tax that company, you can certainly tax the workers, and you can squeeze resources out of that you can then invest into the society as a whole, in infrastructure, education, and redistribution of wealth. That can work. It certainly works, and it has worked. And I think it did work until the late 1970s, early 1980s, when the marketing departments and human resources departments of companies started taking over these companies. And the reason they took over the companies was because advertising didn't work any longer. And when the internet came along, it certainly didn't work any longer, because it was called spam, and we hate it. We know that every corporate newsletter we ever get, every fucking customer survey, we hate the customer service, right? So we get a customer survey. A customer survey, when you get in the mailbox, it's exactly what capitalism is. Now, if you don't understand why we all hate capitalism, you haven't read a customer survey. You should do it at least once to understand how horrible it is. That's what it is. It's rape. Capitalism can stop itself from raping your brain if it can, to squeeze your resources out of you, to buy their fucking products and services, even if you don't need them and you don't want them. That is how advertising works. And that's why over here now in Europe, advertising people and marketing are furious at people like me, who now point out that woke will obviously go for capitalism next, because it was a capitalist endeavor to begin with. It started with marketing departments and advertising in the 1980s. And we sort of, if you remember, the last 30 years, the commercials have sort of deviated from the product more and more and more. Mm-hmm. So, it's no longer about the product at all. And they call that branding, and they call it lifestyle. And we're supposed to emotionally connect with the product, thinking we desperately need it. And we then got this other fantastic good news for Marxism called algorithms. And algorithms mean that we don't need ads at all any longer. That's bad news for capitalism, because it means that capitalism's usual way of forcing itself onto us, raping us, is through advertising, meaning capitalism has no way to communicate with its customers any longer. But why should it? Because it's raped us for the past 100 years. Why we want to talk to capitalism? We don't want to talk to companies. And it's precisely today where the companies, corporations, have these courses, weekend courses, where they train all their employees to open Instagram and Twitter accounts to talk about how lovely it is to go to work. That's mental rape. And I tell all the workers now, say, don't do that. Tell them to fuck off. Tell them your personal Instagram, Twitter account is your face, your front to the outside world as a citizen, as a family person, as a family member, as a part of your community, your congregation, where you talk about what you feel is necessary for you, and where you deserve respect and you deserve free speech. And we need to get the corporations out of here. And I think the way to do it is just expose the enormous hypocrisy and expose the sort of rape culture that actually not only Facebook, but all modern corporations are involved in this. Marketing departments, advertising, communications departments. I mean, how do they communicate with us? They force us to read their fucking newsletters. They force the ads in our faces. We hate them. We hate them. We hate them. And they won't get the message that they're the most hated thing ever in history. They just won't get that. And I think this is why woke ultimately is a capitalist problem. It's not really a political problem, problem of left or right. It really is a problem with large capitalist corporations. I think the social dilemma just pointed out at some of the problems of Silicon Valley, but I think all corporations, all of the economy is like this today.
Yeah. Well, where should we go from here?
Well, that we talked about capitalism and attentionalism here. So the point is this: the algorithms should be free and open, and at least attempted that 10 years ago. But the reason why so many people are leaving Google and go for DuckDuckGo or somewhere else to search is that we get this eerie feeling that the algorithms have been compromised. And the three enemies that are compromising algorithms, I've seen it inside of Google myself, is the corruption of money, the manipulation of politics, and the conformation of academia. The sort of corrupt, old school, privileged academia out today. It's trying to conform us into think all the same way. Conform us into think that there's no alternative. There's no other way. The world cannot be any different. Conformation, really good word. It's really nasty thing. The conformation from academia, where everything is streamlined and nobody ever says anything that objects to the current situation or the current power structure. The current power structure is held in place, enormously. And that's conformation. I would say conformation is, if you talk about the people who both want to stop Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump in 2016, but precisely the conformationists out there. Then you have the manipulation of politics from both left and right, where they try to screw your brain and change your mind through algorithms. And then, of course, the corruption of money, when the ads sneak into the algorithm feed. So the ads are no longer like a warning sign to the right of your webpage, but rather they've sneaked in and they're at the top of the page all of a sudden. Well, get out, get a better search engine, leave Google, whatever. But when you get this eerie feeling that the algorithms are trying to control your mind and they're no longer reflecting you or what you're looking for, or even the kind of challenges you're looking for to be smarter, the antagonia we're talking about. When the algorithms don't work that way and don't serve you any longer, find a new search engine. It's probably the most radical thing you can do in 2021.
Yeah, my own personal experience has been like, I guess, doing what you're saying, and Google Scholar is great for kind of harvesting academic research, and so is academia.edu, where a lot of profs just upload their stuff freely, right? And so, yeah, and you could call that a kind of open source, part of the open source movement.
Well, you don't have to go to Harvard or Berkeley any longer. You can go to praxis.com and get a package for 100th of the price. I mean, yes, the tech startups are usually on our side. And as long as they don't pretend to be social media platforms to only control our brains and monitor what we do, they're fine. Yeah, the tech startups of the world are still working for a netocratic revolution. They're part of a new power structure that we then will have to hold responsible for very, very different reasons compared to the people who are attacking the algorithms at the moment. These are the old institutions: politics, mass media, academia, old industry, marketing departments. Those are the guys that are attacking the algorithms today and try to manipulate them. That's why it's an attentionless struggle against capitalism to open up for an attentionless society. And what we should do today is to reread Karl Marx and see the tensionalist power structure as the proletariat. And the proletariat, in this case, will then divide into informationalism, which is data processing, especially with open source, hackers and everything, sensocracy, which is like, yeah, we all now have access to the data. Let's distribute the data widely so everybody can use it for mutual benefit. Again, if you open source it, you go towards a communist direction. And the third one after you do sensocracy is creating a protopian ideal for art and artistic expression, which is where the symbolic realm would exist once the autocracy is in place. These three different things, informationalism, sensocracy, and protopianism, are really the new power elite that we've been writing about for over 20 years. We're witnessing its birth. And here's the good news if you're a communist. This is potentially a route towards communism. That is why we have to go back to repeat Karl Marx again. But look at it like socialism was a failed enterprise. It was too early in history. Marx was ironically right in his critique of Lenin, but he should have critiqued himself the same way. Like, it's too early, brother. It's too early. You can't do it yet. But I think we can definitely see that attentionalism provides a platform in which communism can be built.
Well, what do you think about the pink tide and pink tide 2 in Latin America? And, particularly with respect to like Lula da Silva in Brazil and lifting people out of poverty, and that being explicit socialist policies for the 21st century to kind of counter, neocolonialism in those regions, right? And so, but his success actually made him a target and made him imprisoned by the political right, So I think there's a step there that we need to take together to get to your communist protopia.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Spot on. And I'm totally for anything that works long term. So Just study it, see how it works. What are the specific cultural conditions where you introduce a political reform, and what will it end up? The problem with a lot of political reforms is that they only end up benefiting a new political bureaucracy. That has been the case for the last 5,000 years. So if that is the case, you got to hold the people responsible and say, yeah, sounds like a good thing you're proposing here, but actually history has shown that every time we tried it, we just created another really wealthy, stupid bureaucracy, which is the worst thing you can do with resources. It's even worse than having wealthy people who can at least invest their money in the stock exchange. The worst thing you can have is have a political class who are sitting there on their fat asses getting paid to do nothing, because won't help anybody. It's not moving the world forward. These were always Karl Marx's greatest enemies. These were the people he attacked the most. These are people who were just sitting in the way, stopping history from evolving, and just sitting on their fat asses taking rent, as they called it. The people who take rent and do no work, right? So that's usually the case. Now, I'm for any sort of redistributed system that works. And it turns out, this is interesting, we know historically that investing in education infrastructure benefits everybody, especially the poor, right? So, for example, getting a transport network up and running so the people who don't have a car can transport the bodies from point A to point B will all make them wealthier. They'll get better jobs, their kids will go to better schools, they'll be better off. So the meritocracy in society will be wider spread and be increased for all. That's always the goal with politics. But there are cases when actually putting the money into people's pockets directly is better. It's usually not in America or Sweden. And the reason is that it works better in corrupt economies. So, for example, remittances work. I'm a huge fan of remittances. So so we got a lot of people in Europe coming from Africa right now to find work. I'm all for letting them in if they got a job. As soon as they get a job, let them in. We need them. They go to service sectors, low-paid jobs, work hard, but they work their way up. Two things then happen. They can marry somebody and raise a family, their kids will go to school, and those kids will go to school and be highly motivated to succeed because their parents have worked hard. That's always the case historically. Any migrating population, that's always the case. The other thing is, if you go from Africa to Europe and find a job, you're likely to send a sum of money home every month. You send it directly home to your grandmother. It is invested in the house where your family lives, and it's invested in sending your siblings to school, because it doesn't go through all the corrupt sort of political bureaucratic systems where a fancy country like Sweden is giving foreign aid to a country like Burundi. Those systems never work. They create more havoc than they ever create value. It's like American philanthropists throwing things over Africa because they want to look good in the media. They cause more damage than they ever cause good, because they're actually disturbing local organic economic ecosystems in those processes. And if you do that, you create more damage long run than you create more value. Mm-hmm. That's why that's why I think I'm Marxist in the sense that I hate charity with a vengeance. It's historically has always been about the charity events where the poor are never invited, and wealthy people show off their new dresses and make sure the poor only get just enough money so they're still around next year so they can be poor again.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And especially as, I think the key proponent of that critique, also a Bernie surrogate, I guess, is Anand Giridharadas, right? His book, Winners Take All. He's helped really popularize that idea that, you've been aware of for a long time, but he's made that very approachable to the average person. It's kind of, he went inside the elite circles and was getting the testimony from them, even them saying it's not working, and they're just exhausted from this game.
Yeah, so, and now they're kidnapping woke.
Yeah.
So you're gonna have woke charity events all over the place, and they're already happening everywhere. But Leonardo DiCaprio climate change events while he's taking a jet to the event.
Yeah,
right? It's just.
So I'd say
of that already. Yes,
I'd say half the people that you share this opposition with, if half the people are on the right, we don't share the same goals ultimately with them, and so we need to share this critique, get through it, but also converge and agree on the topic of, let's just call it post-capitalism, right? What the transition looks like to a better system that's more just, more redistributive and pre-distributive. And I think, we gotta keep probing deeper
and I'm there. That's why I'm skeptical about even introducing the term pre-distribution. I don't think it exists. My point is that I have never seen And I am a great proponent of attentionalism being different from capitalism. But attentionalism is built on a capitalist system that works somehow. And then capital will flow where the attention goes. So ultimately, the people who get the attention will have the capital eventually, because they'll be the only ones that will successfully communicate in this type of society. Therefore, the capital will go their way. Not current influencers, because they're going to lose that pretty quickly, because they're all whores. They're selling the wrong thing. They're actually fighting the algorithms to try to manipulate them. But I mean, people who take algorithms seriously and suddenly realize they're in a position where people trust them in what they say. Digital is going to be enormous honesty, brutal honesty. And if that's as capitalism, it's also brutal honesty if we dare to look it in the face. It's not like it's hiding what it's up to. But I would say I'm skeptical of pre-distribution. I'll perfectly happy look into the idea. I can still be convinced about universal basic income, but I still haven't seen a single argument. I've only seen people who try to escape the hard kernel, the brutal truth, the real reality, which is that there are resources, they're accumulated and they're limited, and they must be taxed and taken from one place and put into another place, hopefully and for the right reasons, for us to redistribute the very platform on which an attentional society can be built.
Yeah, I'll just add to that point on taxes. Like Andres noted yesterday, and I've thought this for a long time. Like he put it very succinctly. Taxes can be used to punish or support social action and social change, right? But we often, because of how the assumptions in Washington D.C. and in Congress already, there's such a minority of change makers in there. The assumptions are wrong, and so taxes are being used to actually empower and enable military contractors, all the wrong things. So it's completely backwards in that sense. So like,
yeah, carbon taxes, for example, they're almost not existent in the United States, right?
And
okay, at least we have them in Scandinavia. I'm proud of it. But
all these debates are
if you know that climate change is a problem, if you know the cost of it, it's been scientifically proven, it's considered a problem. Not that I might change. I'm not a big person on climate change for the simple reason I don't mind if people get to move now and then, right? So because I'm a huge fan of migration, I'm not too desperate on climate change. But it's undisputably a fact that's happening, and it's causing a lot of damage, and it's costly. Get a fucking carbon tax out there. And they won't. Why? Because they're completely bought in by the lobbies of a power structure that refuses to pay these taxes.
Yeah, exactly.
And if the world goes down with it, they don't care.
Yeah. So what I try to do is to depoliticize the way, discourse analysts especially talk about these things, to make sure that we're on the same page, and not just anti-capitalist, but post-capitalist. I think anti-capitalism is married with the naivete that you describe about the Occupy movement, and it all ends up getting captured, right? We need an authentic post-capitalist vision that kind of converges us together rather than bottlenecks us and makes us all fight each other over this or that. So maybe we should talk about Biden and geopolitics and what's going right or wrong in that sector. What do you think?
Yeah, and my disappointment with Jordan Peterson and his comeback.
Oh, I'd love to talk about that.
Let's start with the Biden political thing. Yeah, it is obviously an elite that we already know that has taken over Washington, D.C., and they've done so with fervor and tons of energy, and certain symbols, and then the reality out there. Okay, it's back to a normal that we know from before. I don't think it's shocking in any way. I think Biden moved quicker than anybody expected, but he's also, he's not being accessible. He does the press conferences. He's trying to avoid all kind of political debate, and his discourse basically that I can't stand standing in the limelight being exposed, because he can't live up to that. So he's moving very quietly, at least for the next 4 years, and that apparently is the policy they decided to pursue. And they're back more or less with the Democratic Congress. At least it's easy now to get majorities behind Biden's ideas. So yeah, it helps to get COVID-19 shots out there. Trump obviously failed in that department. Other than that, I think the policies between Trump and Biden are not that different. They're shockingly similar, as expected. The war between the two sides was largely symbolic, and it's actually a culture war that represented completely different things in America than actually the two politicians stood for.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, again, I haven't even tracked it that closely. I just check in different outlets I follow, but, at least, we got some, let's say, concessions. Bernie Sanders is the chair of the budget committee now, and that's significant to him. I respect that role, and his role. So I think it's these are steps in the right direction, but also I don't want to oversell it. Like it.
No.
It's
We
still.
both want better, fresher candidates 4 years from now. A whole new generation of way more digitally savvy and more honest candidates, because of digital savviness means honesty, right? So, this was like, okay, the last of the old, and they're out. I mean, like I sarcastically said last year, hey, what happened? America's supposed to be the center of the world. You got an election where you're picking between Cartman from South Park and a Corona corpse. It's just like, it's not like the freshest, most inspiring election ever. It's just hysterical and weird. And I'm glad Trump is out, at least for the moment. It got more serious, and all for the better. It's just, we were tired of the TV show, and we didn't want the TV show in the White House. But that's exactly what happened. A TV show moved into the White House, and they turned Nancy Pelosi into the evil witch, and it lasted 4 years, and it's finally over. But when it comes to all the drama about the storming of the Congress, really, I couldn't care less. It's not a sacred building. It's not a sacred building at all. I couldn't care less any of that. And yeah, you got the weirdos, and the weirdos were there, and they're there all the time. And, they'll come back again. They'll call themselves deplorables proudly next time. They have their own pride marches. They're certainly part of American culture. And as long as, they see West Virginia drenched in fentanyl instead of good new jobs, they probably will be better. So it's just America. Just America.
Yeah.
The Jordan Peterson question.
Yeah.
Okay. Jordan Peterson and the lovely Camille Paglia, who we should call the real Jordan Peterson. Now, if you want a scholar who's sort of in the same vein but much better, Camille Paglia's sexual persona is surely, 100 times better than Jordan Peterson's maps of meaning. This is the 1990s. Jordan Peterson, though, became the media phenomenon of the two, because he's a man largely. And we know the kind of struggle he took. I sided with it quite strongly. You did not, because I saw the need for him, because I saw the problem of a woke left that I wanted to avoid. He was a good enemy of those and a good opponent. And he took the debate. He didn't silence his opponents, which was honest. He then went on a rock star tour. And I think I at least warned him about it, at least staying on the tour too long.
Yeah.
I used to work in the music industry. I know it freaks people out. I mean, it killed Prince. It killed Whitney Houston. It killed Michael Jackson. It should have killed Madonna.
He made a lot of money.
But he probably made money and then lost it. I don't think he's a good businessman. And that's why the tour stayed for so long. My guess is had to double the tour because he lost so much money on the first half of the tour. They had to extend the tour to a second round. We all know what happened to his head. His brain freaked out. He got into some kind of benzodependency, and then turned the Peterson family into the Kardashians of academia. So we've seen a sort of Canadian Kardashian circus around the Peterson family. Bless them. I'm glad they're together. I think his wife is fantastic. Tammy's great. Michaela is stunningly beautiful. But it's like talking about interested. And when they came back, or Jordan came back, of course, the first things he did was to do these podcasts with Michaela, where he was just sitting there like he just got out of a retirement home. It was obviously being used for his name for no reason at all. And there was nothing new there. And finally, he came out with his book, Beyond Order, supposedly a follow-up to the first book. Clearly, this is what the publishing company asked him to do, to try to sell as many copies as possible. And of course, it's sales pitches everywhere, having turned Jordan Peterson into a vulgar, banal consumer product. It's exactly the sort of thing you don't do any longer if you know anything about the internet. He's exactly sort of the corporate mass advertising, forcing things down your throat and not caring about whether people are going to read the book or not. I think as a writer myself, I never care about the quantity of the books I sell. I don't live on book sales. I care about the people who actually read, dig into the books, find faults and things in them, and then want to write even better books. That's what writing should be about. Not that Jordan Peterson cared. This was obviously about making more money to the family, right? So he started selling the book. There's been a couple of good interviews that have ignored the book. The trigonometry guys, I think, do a good thing with the sort of alt-rightish, but smarter and funnier way of doing things. And they also, it's a Russian guy and an English guy. They're not Americans. Highly recommended. They do great stuff. Kara Smith the other day was fantastic on trigonometry. But they took Jordan seriously. They read the book, held him responsible for it, and actually got him to talk about things that he's good at: clinical psychology and at best anthropology. But the problem with Jordan Peterson was always the blind spot. The same with Kamapaga is their constant critique of a ghost they call postmodernism. It's no better than radical feminists going on about patriarchy. To me, they're just ghosts to make up. And somehow they think they've proven something by putting this P word up there and then going after the P word and then throwing all kinds of people into this P word box that didn't even live when there possibly could have been a postmodern, like attacking Jacques Lacan. Sorry, Jordan Peterson. If you don't understand Jacques Lacan, it's because you're too stupid to understand Jacques Lacan. It's not because he's too obscure or he's pretentious or he's not a good philosopher. Jacques Lacan was one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century. He put an end to Western nihilism, more or less, by completing it, right? And if you don't understand that, you become Jordan Peterson, who went up against Slavoj Žižek in Toronto and was slaughtered. Slavoj slaughtered him. He came ill prepared. He talked about things he didn't know, and he put up this ghost he's got called postmodernism that he's allowed to attack at all times. It's like the dragon he's fighting. And at the end of the day, you go, so what does postmodernism mean in the Jordan Petersonian sense? And you discover there's nothing there.
Yeah, I've got
that's the problem.
I've got the email thread open from your email list about it's actually based on Jonathan's article, Petersonitis, which was a couple years ago now. And so some of the talking points you've just mentioned, I recognize from that thread too.
I think you republished a piece last year, 2020, because I'm actually referring to the 2020 version of the Petersonitis. Okay. Right. Where he had an argument that he sensed was kind of very talented. It was interesting, but he's really opened up. And this is between back and the book published. So this is a 2020 text by Jonathan Rawson on Petersonitis. It's absolutely brilliant. And it's brilliant in the sense that it points out the mistakes of both sides of the sort of Jordan Peterson divide, right? And it also points towards the future, which Jordan Peterson does not himself any longer.
Yeah, it is a great article. I still think it understates the accidental threat Peterson poses. And like, I just wanted to bring up the point quickly, like when he went on tour, he brought along Dave Rubin as a sidekick and as an opener, because Dave Rubin's like identifies as an attempted comedian, right? But you challenged me on that last time that it was like a guilt by association kind of thing, because I was trying to make headway into my whole IDW critique, to kind of tie that together. But it's not. I mean, Dave Rubin is eminently critiquable, and the content he produces is pretty exclusive, and we're trying to break that narrative of which Peterson played a huge role, that, as you suggest, with postmodernism and of course with Marxism too, as you've elaborated on. Peterson has no grounding in what he's talking about. He's read something, but he has no citation, and he has no place in that discourse. He's just an erratic kind of just complaining. But anyways, I think the deeper critique that I had anticipate a lot of the dumb, missteps Peterson made, and the lack of self-reflection that we still see in his comeback, and just, the fan base that created and how divisive it became, and Michelle Bowens is, complaining about his experiences. And so, I never dismissed Peterson outright, right? I kind of embraced the exercise of engaging in his work. I found a very high degree of explicit abstraction in his book Maps of Meaning and in some of the ways Peterson talks sometimes. But it speaks to this meta crisis that nobody, not you, not people close to Peterson, not Rawson, can get through to the guy. There's no magic stake you can sell him that will make him budge on anything.
And, you would think like a guy like Zachary Stein, who's written this brilliant book on the future of education, that would be a book that Jordan Peterson would have dug into, but he hasn't. I don't think he's read at
Right.
all of
No, and
it. This is a repetition of the same.
Yeah.
And I'll give you an example. Why I defend Dave Rubin is I don't assume that Dave Rubin would ever be anything but a TV journalist. He's running a little talk show on TV. He's not an intellectual. At least he's not pretentious. The problem with Jordan Peterson is that he pretends that he's a philosopher and he pretends that he's a metaphysicist. He's not. He's none of those two things. He's not even close. He's a pre-Kantian naivist, if you're honest about his philosophy. If you check the arguments and you sort of place them on the metaphysical map, this is pre-Kantian naivism. This is not even understanding Kant. This is definitely not understanding a word of Hegel. It's not understanding Nietzsche. His Nietzsche reading, yes, it's good in the sort of, he's a good Nietzsche storyteller. He's a good sort of college teacher on Nietzsche. But his proper reading on Nietzsche is more Ayn Rand than it's actually Nietzsche himself. That is so obvious. And I'll give you an example of that. If you were irritated with him taking Dave Rubin on tour, I would say the real disaster this time was Jordan Peterson going on God Saad's TV show, God Saad's show. Just checking God Saad, Jordan Peterson 2021. It is so embarrassing. Yeah. And just check how many times they use the P word, postmodernism, without ever explaining what they mean with that word. Just check how many times they throw people into that category that weren't even alive, that were dead long before postmodernism could possibly even have happened. And they can't even refer to any, they don't refer to any sources. It's just this ghost that they're attacking and it's evil and vile. And it's like, you feel like, are these guys even 11 years old? You know, or are they 7? And they're attacking this ghost like the good soldiers fighting evil or something. And this is God's side at his worst, but certainly Jordan Peterson is part of the race.
Yeah. And I mean,
to me, it's, if it was Rubin and Peterson, to me, it's Saad and Peterson that exposes his weakness, which is philosophical naivety that is now considering his position getting very costly.
Yeah. And I think in a way you're hitting the nail on the head, but I need to try to add to the articulation, which is like the things people like Peterson and God Saad are saying, and the whole IDW and the kind of peripheral, actors in that, first of all, in your attentional economy, they're succeeding immensely and influencing millions of people, and not sufficiently engaging in good faith. Like, okay, he'll debate Zizek, but it's kind of a spectacle, and then there's no follow-up kind of self-work or disclosure.
Okay, I should point out there is no attentional economy. There's just economy and attention. Don't, and they're losing out because attention is valued long-term. Jordan Peterson is a phenomenon. He rose up. He's now in his sort of Whitney Houston taking drugs in the bathtub phase. And I think the risk that he's going to go back to the drugs again, since it's different to talk about it, is very strong. I wish he won't. And I wish he would sit down and go back to clinical psychology and do what he's good at. That sort of humility would save his career. But I don't expect that to happen. That's probably where we're at right now.
Yeah. The second thing I wanted to say is I think the way these guys talk and the way they're encouraged to be, pushed right is everything that they say is dynamite for the political right. It's moving a lot of, like, they think they're centrist or whatever, some kind of faux centrism, but this is just like jet fuel for the culture war. And
can I give you two examples? Can I give you two examples that really exposes it? Fresh examples. Okay. Jordan Peterson subtly says he refuses to answer the question whether he believes in God or not. What is that? A real cynical right with, the North American Christian right, who probably are his career these days, right? Otherwise, why wouldn't you say? I mean, you can problematize it. You have enough space, online to problematize it and discuss and tell people what you mean with God. I do. I put God in the future. That solved the problem from being an atheist, right? I can explain it in a sentence. He could too, but he refuses to. Why? He's gone cynical, and it's obvious, right? The other thing I was thinking about when it comes to Jordan Peterson is that he then says that capitalism is nasty and evil, but can't be dealt with. Wait, what is that? Wait a second. You write books that are supposed to inspire people to change the world, and you stop at make your bed in the morning, and then you said, and by the way, when we get to chapter 2, You can't do anything about it. Where did that kind of cynicism come from? You're absolutely spot on. This is a kind of cynical flirtation with the American right, where it's so easy actually to see where the arguments are really thin and have no validity. If you don't believe the world can be changed, and if you don't believe that resources can basically be redistributed and put into productive use rather than accumulated, which is not, it's not rocket science to even argue for. It's been done. It can be done again. Now, if you don't want to be part of that and you say it cannot be done, well, then get out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
Keep your mouth shut. Allow somebody else to take the stage and get the attention because you don't deserve it.
Yeah.
It's cynical nihilism in its worst form. That's what it is.
Yeah. No, I'm glad we're on the same page, and you can articulate these things, because I have no bandwidth for Peterson anymore, and watching these things. And there's when I talked to you was before I went on the Jim Rutt podcast. I did that, and I got the chance actually to list off a few of my sources, just so we weren't going on a huge tangent. And this isn't to do with Jordan Peterson, but the kind of IDW writ large. But like, there's a podcast called, I Don't Speak German, and there's a few key people that I track on Twitter, and I'm basically just saying, like, look at these people. They're doing the critical analysis and commentary of these actors that I was doing 2 years ago. They're doing it well. Just like, we don't need to waste time. And I kind of gave Jim Rutt flack for having James Lindsay on the podcast, right? One of these IDW kind of grifters, sycophants, whatever you want to call them, ultimately a kind of bad faith researcher. He hate reads critical theory, just to kind of attempt to debunk it. And so, again, I'm not saying don't talk to these people. I'm saying know what you're dealing with and really attempt to change each other's minds. And actually, just to pivot from this point to something that's more fresh, Jordan Hall talked to this fascist guy, Brandon Hayes, a couple weeks ago on Jordan's channel, and Jordan's like joking that he's giving a middle finger to Sauron or whatever. He's going to get canceled for it, but he thinks he's doing something edgy. But the nonsense of that crossover.
This is where you and I disagree. I think it does. And
okay, but I'll finish the point.
I'm totally for re-platforming and giving voices to the people I hate the most, more than ever.
Good.
Because we need to sort of balance the whole de-platforming thing. So I'm re-platformer.
Yeah.
I think it was edgy by Jordan Hall, actually. So we might disagree on that one. Yeah,
that's great. That's great, though. If you believe that, then tell Jordan to unblock me and reach out for an interview, because I reached out to him after that Brandon Hayes thing.
So he re-platformed a fascist, but de-platformed you.
Yeah, he de-platformed me last year, right?
People.
I know. I respect that. I just want to declare for myself, for you, for everybody, I'm against blocking as a practice, because I think it goes awry really quickly. You're trying to curate your epistemic ecosystem. Okay, I get it, but you're doing it wrong. And this is what I was trying to tell the Game B people, as they were embracing the proprietarians and pushing me and other lefties away for a host of reasons that were invalid, and so at least Jim talked to me on numerous occasions. I give him credit for that. But Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jordan Hall blocked me, quite unceremoniously, and that was that. They're off my radar for the most part since last summer. And
I love these guys. I must say that, but they have blocked you, and that's a fact. So now they're being exposed.
Yeah. And
what they do with that information, we'll see. But at least I'm a big fan of all three of you. So there you go.
Yeah, and I'm pretty powerless, but I try to use people like Peter Lindbergh or you or whoever as intermediaries or liaisons to make shit happen, right? But the final point on this is that Jordan Hall and David Fuller on Rebel Wisdom a week or two ago did mention me by name, sort of in passing, in the context of this sense-making crisis, right? And gatekeeping who's in, who's out. And they mentioned me in passing in kind of a dismissive way, like, who's this guy, blah, blah, blah. But, I did point out to all of them, the proprietarians are bad news. And they're discovering things I discovered 2 years ago. But I never blocked Brandon Hayes. He blocked me 2 years ago, right? So he's been invisible on me to Facebook for like 2 years. And this is what I'm saying is, like, I've talked to a few of these meta right guys. I track them. I'm not into blocking anybody because it's like a Black Mirror episode. You're just closing off, semi-permanently some other channel for information flow that is really relevant to this sense-making crisis.
You can't credibly sit and
Mhm.
dismiss deplatforming culture online and at the same time block tons of people through your own channels. You can't do that. Blocking is not about saving time. Blocking is really about getting rid of somebody, sending a signal they're unacceptable. That's exactly what deplatforming is. And I think the only decent thing to do, no matter where you are on the political landscape or spiritual landscape or whatever, is to go radically replatforming. That means force yourself, even if you're uncomfortable, to unblock and re-platform and reinstate people and talk to people who are as far away from yourself as possible. And do it consequentially. I mean, if you do it with some people because they're cool and you got to do it with the guys who currently are out of the fad or out of the fashion. Because you know what? 2 years from now, those guys that were considered too extreme to hang out with are the guys that saying the most interesting things and probably said it all along. That's always the case. That's why you and I believe so strongly in this word antagonia, antagony. We propose it all the time. You never get smarter than the people you talk to who oppose you. If you only surround yourself with people who agree with you, you'll become the underclass of an attentional society. You become a stupid idiot. The only way to become powerful and influential and succeed, and why would you want to do that, is actually to immerse yourself in an antagonic culture all the time. Like, people are posting on them. Good, interesting. What do they have to say, right? And you and I can't sit and have these discussions, these nuanced discussions. We can go after Jordan Peterson, who I supported heavily when he came along. But I can also see the problems, like maybe should have waited another year and written a book about benzodependency instead of going all high-minded and becoming pretend to be a philosopher when he doesn't have that capacity at all. It's just those kind of things that we point out, and we wish them well. And it's a critique that is not about the people. It's a critique about the behavior, and it's a critique about the opinions that they distribute. That's all there's to it.
Yeah,
Minds can always be changed.
Yeah, I'm glad we got a chance to touch on those things. And we're a little bit over an hour, and I wanted to make space still, if you have the bandwidth for it, to talk more specifics on geopolitics. And over email, I raised the issue of the Israel-Palestine sort of conflict and topic that I'd like to talk about. You're welcome to refuse.
Okay.
Sort of as Jim refused
the problem is this one. What I always point out is that, I'm a huge fan of Israel and of Palestine. And I'm serious about it. I go to both countries. I go there all the time. I've got a place in Istanbul. I fly to Palestine. Love the West Bank. I think Gaza, if they get around to it, could be the new Dubai, because Dubai really is a copy of the original Gaza, right? Gaza has fantastic opportunities, so does the West Bank, as things are right now, right? So I'm a big defender of both places. I would definitely prefer a one-state solution that should be secular. That's always been my position. So, but my point is, what you and I joked about is that what I take offense from is that a lot of American college kids love to get involved in the Israel-Palestine issue because they side with thinking Palestinians are David, Israel's the Goliath, and they fall into this mode. And I just want to point out the fact that the United States is a very young country. And in the 19th century, it was built on the biggest slaughter ever in human history, which was the slaughter of Native American Indians. And they were slaughtered, and killed by smallpox, if nothing else. 90% of them, at least, more than 90% of them went extinct. Okay. Holocaust is nothing compared to this, what happened in North America. And anybody today who happens to live on North American territory and who is not like major Native American Indian, is actually benefiting from that slaughter. And if you talk to, say, modern Israeli Jewish citizen, there are a lot of Israeli Arab citizens, which we should be reminded of. But if you talk to an Israeli Jewish citizen who came, the 2 generations ago, they immigrated usually from the Arab world. They came out of Damascus and Baghdad. There was a land swap going on, certainly. It could be argued that was, a good idea. But they say, if you want to critique them for treating Palestinians really bad in the West Bank and Gaza and not being peaceful, solving the conflict or whatever, if you want to go into that critique, you can't really do it as an American college kid. you haven't earned that position at all, starting from where you're at, and symbolically, rebaptizing your college with some kind of Native American Indian name is nothing. It's just, no, sorry. These are people you killed. You can't even repay them. Just got to recognize the fact that this is part of history. We've always murdered, we've slaughtered, we've plundered, we migrated, and we killed people when we migrated, and we took over other people's territory and killed them, especially the men, and raped their women, and that's history. And North America is a fresh part of that. You can't just say that, well, it's everything up to the year 1900 we can just forget about. And then everything after 1945 we must take very seriously. It's just like, no, that's not a valid argument. I would disagree on that strongly. And even Hawaii, although that was like Tibet, was a terrible feudal state before it was conquered by the Americans. You can argue for the communist Chinese invasion of Tibet for the simple reason that finally was modernized. You can argue for the invasion of Hawaii the same way, but it wasn't the Hawaiians who got the vote for whether they wanted to be part of the United States or not. They were slaughtered too. And they were only thrown into the United States in 1959, the same year that China occupied Tibet. So if you critique China for occupying Tibet, it's hard if you're American. It's if you don't see your own blind spots in these arguments, then that's hard.
Yeah, and I basically confessed agreement with you over email, and I can confirm a lot of what you just said because I recognize that, and also I'll just set it up by way of an anecdote. About 12 years ago, before I wrote my Israel Politique paper, which I think is a good kind of talking point. Actually, the essay did really well, but I went to an Israel-Palestine debate. Actually, let me also just set up, I use the term Israel-Palestine conflict, and other lefties use it too, but I've also seen that problematized to say that, if it's apartheid, let's call it apartheid. It's not an Israel-Palestine conflict. So the language we use, colors how the debate is framed, and that's partly what my article was about. But the anecdote is, I showed up at this debate as an attendee. An Israeli and a Palestinian student really got heated and in the thick of it and just shouting past each other. And I'm sitting back there like very self-aware that I a white man, Canadian, I have no experience in this, no stake in this. I've never been there. But that, by studying it and writing a paper, hopefully I could contribute to what the meta problem was arising between them that was deeper than the superficial hostilities between them, right? Because this is a really sticky problem, and the UN has tried to kind of weigh in on it time and time again, and basically, not to oversimplify, all efforts at resolution are subverted by things like the Israel Lobby, which is a large basket of kind of right-wing think tanks and public actors like Alan Dershowitz, right? So there's a real meta problem there that needs to be deconstructed, and there needs to be a convergence between you and I on like helping them solve the problem, because it's a geopolitical issue. And so the key point I want to raise is a thing called new anti-Semitism, right? That's a scholarship that identifies this trend of labeling criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. And so this is just such a...
It is anti-Zionist, which should point out it's not anti-Semitic.
Yes. I'm
leveling critique at a nation state called Israel. It's not a Judaism or Jewish heritage or Jewish ancestry whatsoever.
Yeah, I'm fine with that distinction. But if I was to say, hey, I'm an anti-Zionist, then somebody would certainly conflate that with anti-Semitism. And so, me being a Bernie supporter and him being Jewish, and then the whole debacle about the British Labour Party fostering or harboring anti-Semites or whatever. The thing with that is, like, I think it was exposed at the time and after the fact that it was basically a right-wing smear. And I'm trying to defend people like Corbyn for that movement to be a part of our movement and our discourse, and vice versa, so we can actually solve this crisis. But it lapses back into the finger pointing and claims of anti-Semitism, which are just ultimately kind of baseless, and it actually pits different factions of Jews against each other, right? So like, Barry
Yeah, but
Weiss is Jewish.
I think the problem here, if I do play devil's advocate here, to begin with, the Israeli right lobby is weaker in Europe than it is in North America. It's less of a problem here.
Sure.
There's a strong Israeli left lobby as well. You support the state of Israel, but you also listen to support the Palestinians. You try to reach some kind of solution. I'm against the two-state solution. I think it should be one-state solution and secular. I think Jews can also live in a secular state because the rest of us do. I don't think it's that difficult. That also means I can defend my desire to turn Iran into a secular state. I cannot fight the mullahs in Iran unless I am here consequential and say, I think all nation states should be secular, period, right? So that's why it's a strong argument, because I think the Iran ordeal is a much bigger issue globally than actually Israel-Palestine. And I think Israel actually clever enough right now to do deals with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, United Arab Emirates. They're getting out of the conflict. Palestine is becoming a burden to the Arab world. That's not where they make their money any longer. And they want to get it off they want to get it off somewhere. And there are even wealthy Palestinians living in Dubai these days who want to get the whole thing off the table because they don't seem served by it any longer. Probably because if they see themselves as Arabs, there's a whole world they can move to and live in. But if they see themselves as Palestinian Arabs, specifically located in the Palestinian territory, it's a completely different issue. So I would say this. I think this is the way. I think it's easier for an Israeli person of the right to have a debate on this clearly with another Palestinian Arab than it is to talk to a white middle-class person from Europe and North America who just position themselves from a certain perspective to gain certain attentional favors from it. And I think that's why they got terrified of Corbyn letting a lot of people into the Labour Party in the UK, because these were not Arabs. These were not Palestinians joining the party who had, completely defensible arguments against the state of Israel and his claims, right? No, these were white middle-class people who just took the position they would go there. And that's why they're terrifying. Because once you are a white middle-class person who take an academic position where it tells you can make a career out of being pro-Palestinian, because you always go for David against Goliath, no matter of the complexity of the issues, or no matter whether it's relevant to you or not. So you get American college teachers who then support Palestine to get favors from that. And that's when it gets scary, because for them, to be honest, the surface between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is very thin. That's a very.
But you're familiar with Norman Finkelstein, right? Like he's an archetypal example, in my view, of someone who has not benefited at all. In fact, he's been punished immensely for taking the position he's taken. And in my view, he's one of the most prominent.
Aren't we talking about a Jewish guy here, though?
Yeah, a Jewish guy whose parents were killed in the Holocaust too.
Jewish or Arab. The thing is this: why Netanyahu is actually popular with Arabs. I explain why. Benjamin Netanyahu is like a really stern, extreme right politician who's ruled Israel for the past 10 years through a lot of manipulation. Okay, the Netanyahu family, the way they rule Israel, why they're popular with Arabs, is because they're dicks. They're like, yeah, we're like really Israeli Jews. Okay. It's easier for them to deal with, I'm a real Palestinian Arab, than it's to deal with this sort of seaweedy kind of Western discourse. You get all these sort of college professors and journalists and everything who take positions. Now, I don't doubt at all the people who have really thought through this issue and have very serious opinions about it. But I think what terrifies a lot of Jews is that the sort of anti-Zionists who are very adamant they're not anti-Semitic, but they're very anti-Zionist. Yeah, but this is more than the state of Israel to you already, and you're ready to go further down the line, obviously, if it suits your career. That's why they're terrified of the anti-Semitism hiding behind it. So we need to watch out at all times about this issue. We really do. We need to do. And speaking about the Middle East, which I love, the Jews are a tiny minority overall in the Middle East. And that's why I'm supportive of Jews. I'm supportive of Kurds. I'm supportive of the smaller minorities, because the large majorities here, the Arabs and the Persians, they can pretty much take care of themselves. It's not that they lack territory or that they lack wealth or that they lack potential. At the end of the day, I look at the entire Middle East when I look at these issues. I refuse to look at it as a tiny territorial conflict. And that's why I personally, when I was 21 years old, traveled through the Arab world, which I love. And I walked into the quarters of Damascus and Baghdad and Tunis and even Sana'a in Yemen. And I saw the empty Jewish quarters that everybody was thrown out in 1948 and sent off to Israel. And these people who left the Arab world are actually the majority of Israeli Jewish citizens, which you should also be reminded of when we look at the complexity of the issues. You hardly ever hear that in America or Europe. But I recommend everybody's interested in this issue, whether you're American or not, go to Israel and Palestine, visit both. They're fantastic countries, make friends in both, learn a little Arabic, maybe some Hebrew, have the best time in your life, and then have an opinion once you visited, have an opinion once you read and study their history and the complexity of it, and just humbly take that opinion, because it is incredibly complex, the whole issue.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to. I think it's a little, if we're fair, it's difficult to travel in Palestine. It's
No,
journalists.
not if you're non-Palestinian. Actually, if you got a Western passport, it's the easiest thing in the world. You go across the border in an Israeli car with car plates, and you can stay there for as many days you like. It's actually easy. That's also one of those things you think is different.
And that can be true.
Yeah.
While not being an argument in favor of the actual what am I trying to say? Like, that's not a good thing that's true. That's white privilege, being able to move freely. But if journalists that travel there, describe kind of Gaza and the West Bank as like open air prisons, right? Just because of the conditions, whether it's through bombing or sanctions, they're really kept impoverished. So I mean, I'd love to see it kind of develop in the way you're talking about, but it needs to be supported to do so. But all that aside,
in that case, Honduras is a precedent today for Hondurans who can't get into the United States. It's no different at all. Apartheid exists everywhere in that sense. Any closed border you cannot cross is in that sense apartheid. So it's not different. No, I disagree. I've been a lot to Ramallah, and I love the place, and I go to the restaurants at night, make a lot of friends. They can problematize situation, and they're like, yeah, we could stay here and do business, and you use the shekel. You are occupied. You're literally in occupied territory. There's no denial about that at all. But as a Palestinian there, you could also go to Dubai and make a career, because you actually have good schools in Palestine. You really do. I mean, things work. Gaza is worse, but that is also because they chose a different path 20 years ago to go really militant with Hamas against the Israelis and send all the rockets in there. And hey, no kidding, but Gaza and Dubai had the same potential, and they still do. And my hopes for Gaza, this might sound really weird to people, but Gaza is the original Beirut. It is the original Dubai. It was the original trading post in the Arab world. It was an incredibly wealthy city. It was the Venice of Middle East. It could still be. It is independent now. The Israelis have moved out. So, I mean, it could still happen, And they got a border next to Egypt, and that's an Arab state. And, it's not like Gaza cannot be connected with the rest of the world. They could if they have great relations with Egypt, but they don't at the moment. So, yeah, I think things can move to a more pragmatic situation over the next 10 years, and that's what I hope. But, yeah, you and I don't have to agree at all on whether you should travel there or not or whatever. I have never, ever pretended that it's not a white privilege to have a Scandinavian passport and can go in and out of Palestine. And my friends joke about the fact that I have to drive a rental car with Israeli plates on it to go back into Israel. That's obvious. That's true. But then again, if nobody visits and nobody gives you another story, then a certain sort of victimhood journalism.
Yeah.
If you don't get the other story of Palestine as well, which is also true, then we end up in the wrong place.
Yeah, and I agree. And just to kind of close this thread out, like, when you drill down, my critique is not a critique of that region per se, because it's limited. And I recognize I haven't been there. My critique is a critique of U.S. empire and the mishandling and the juggling of the Middle East as the kind of foreign policy playground. And I watched Vice a couple weeks ago, the biopic about Dick Cheney. It's a little fresh in my mind, but there's a few things they miss or don't get quite right. And one is that, this is, I think, the most interesting point about all of it is, there's an interview with Dick Cheney from 1994. It's actually in its American Enterprise Institute interview. Nonetheless, Cheney is very candid, saying invading Iraq would be a quagmire because we don't have Arab support, blah, blah, blah. There'd be a power vacuum. And that's exactly what happened a decade later when they invaded. For whatever, underhanded motives, ulterior motives they had. And, my point is multifaceted. I guess on one hand, it's like, how could somebody know exactly have such a good read on the region be against meddling from a conservative perspective, then turn around and pursue exactly that
Because it was paid to.
destabilization strategy.
It was
Yeah.
obviously paid to.
Well,
It's so
exactly. It's a
obvious.
kind
Yeah,
of
exactly.
it's a kind of corporate conspiracy at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But so my critique is against that, the kind of that control over the narrative. And the mainstream media outlets are complicit in perpetuating a kind of both sidesism. And so, both sidesism reigns supreme when we have this kind of silencing of discourse on the issue under this label of new anti-Semitism as a kind of scare word, as anti-Semitism resurgent as a scare word. And I think it dovetails with the kind of, McCarthyism, right? Neo-McCarthyism vis-a-vis Peterson. So, again, as a guy who has no personal stake in it, this is a geopolitical issue that, as part of a paradigm shift, we want to rewrite the script on how diplomacy supersedes the interests of the military industrial complex, and that we can actually start to rapidly solve these meta problems that are compounding the meta crisis. Because we're constantly running out of time and running up against resource limits.
Yeah, and I should add there here that the big
Mhm.
issue though is Iran and how
Mhm.
to deal with Iran,
Mhm.
and that's where I'm personally involved. So I'm gonna go to Iraq hopefully end of this year to visit the Kurds in Kurdistan, in South Kurdistan, as it's called. Should be its own country, but it's the part of Iraq of Kurdistan. And I'm a Zoroastrian. I converted to religion, which is now very popular with Kurds because they obviously don't want to be Muslims any longer because they were fucked in the ass by Islamic State. For understandable reasons, they can also now convert officially in Iraq, which is fantastic. So, but the mess in Afghanistan and certainly the situation in Iran are bigger geopolitical issues. And I don't think the Biden administration has a clue.
No.
Are they going to deal with Iran? Certainly the Europeans don't. It's incredibly difficult. It's very likely that an atomic bomb will blow up somewhere in Iran soon. And then Saudi Arabia and Turkey will probably go for the bomb as well. I consider this to be a bigger geopolitical threat this century than climate change. I still think the spreading of nuclear bombs and nuclear weapons is going to be a bigger, worse issue. Even worse. That's how bad it is. And I don't see anybody as a solution to this. And I see the Chinese are selling stuff to these guys. Xi Jinping is a monstrous dictator. Whatever happened in China in 2014 was on a par with Hitler taking power in 1933. And I think what happens in Burma right now, where they're killing masses of people and forced Aung San Suu Kyi out of office, is nothing but a Chinese dictated military coup to get access to the Indian Ocean. We're worried about China occupying Taiwan. Why would they? They just took Burma, which is way more important to them. And when it comes to what Xi Jinping is doing in China and the Chinese communist dictatorship and a weak Biden administration and America getting lost in capitalism the way it is right now, it's messy. It's really messy. But we'll get back to those conversations. You and I are both interested in them.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we'll start to wind down because we're past an hour and a half. But a word you used in some of your other recent talks, right, that I identify strongly with is cosmopolitanism, and more specifically, sort of the brand I subscribe to, kind of cosmopolitan socialism, and sort of the when you talk about Burma and or Bolivia for that matter, like and you also say that you're willing to go left or right depending on where you are in the world and what the analysis says. I find the leftist analysis, it's not always correct or consistent, but is the most consistent and has the strongest long-term vision. And, for example, Lula, I didn't know this at the time. I didn't know anything about Lula at the time of his presidency, but, he was instrumental in the Iran deal, in formulating it, in being a kind of a diplomat leading that initiative. So it's so important that, through talking about these things, that we actually grow support for a healthy left socialist convergence, which is more clear and prospective than ever on the other side of this 4 or 5 year post-truth nightmare.
Yeah. And let's make a bet here and pray a little to a God does not exist. I don't think Trump will come back, but I think Lula will. I think you'll have a second Lula presidency in Brazil, but I don't think that will ever happen with Trump. So let's see if that happens. That'd be the kind of good news we're looking at. I agree. I don't buy into the socialist narrative, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm certainly communist at heart in the sense that I believe in voluntary communism as the end goal for humanity. It's just, yeah, it's just historically the way to go. But I think right now, sorting out capitalism and internationalism and proving to people how things actually work, and also telling people it's possible to change things. And this is the redistribution of wealth. It's not a question of money itself. It's just taking money from a source where it's being gained and accumulated to put it to good use, investing it in a society for everybody. And this is where the left is right. The left is right that it's always proposing a shared value to more people rather than the accumulation of enormous wealth to the few. And if you look at the world today, hey, the left has a massive agenda ahead of it. That to me is the left. It's very concrete. It's very simple. Redistribution of wealth to invest in the future.
Yeah, I agree, and I'll double down on my MMT point that what you proposed is compatible with the MMT discourse, the way that they're trying to open up an even broader discussion about fundamental shift. You know, they're not quite, they use the term paradigm shift. They're not quite using all the same language I'm proposing through metamodernism and things like that, but there's a great deal of alignment there.
Yeah. Just make sure that if these guys are promising the wealthy that they're not going to have to pay taxes or higher tax in the future, they're not. No, then they're okay. They're okay, because anything else than that, it's lying. It's just outright lying. Good. This is great, Brent. I think you're fantastic. I love your sort of monkish personality, and I hope this recording went well. And anybody who happens to still watch us after an hour and a half or more than that, get engaged with us. And I should point out one little correction. The IDW you talk about, sort of dismiss, is the intellectual dark web. Yeah. There's also an intellectual deep web beneath it, which also calls itself the IDW Junior, if you like, and it's now thriving. And it will certainly survive the intellectual dark web, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I'm a member, for better or worse. It's tough to keep up with all the threads sometimes, but I appreciate your openness to engage over these topics and to let me to let us both practice, let's say. I mean, I have a lot further to go in sharpening my sword, but I really value this engagement, and yeah, I hope we touched on enough things, and that it's interesting enough to listen to and engage with.
Yeah, sure thing. Big love, brother.
Okay, thanks. Take care.
Yes.
Talk to you later.
I'm off to bed over here. Thanks a lot.
Bye.